when I retired from municipal policing in 2018, after decades in uniform, one of which I actually was Sergeant Slaughter. I left my team with some words of wisdom. 4, exactly. They were the 4 P's of policing: purpose, power, partnerships, and play. At the time, I thought those lessons were just for law enforcement. I didn't realize that they would guide me through one of the most difficult chapters of my life. Because when I left the job, what stayed with me wasn't the badge or the uniform. It was a pinky promise. In 2020, I found myself on Manitoulin Island, a new inspector overseeing patrol operations for First Nations Police Service in Northern Ontario. I was overcoming my own trauma. I'd retired from a municipal service after 28 years. I'd left my family after discovering financial loss spanning years. I was starting over entirely alone and emotionally and financially devastated. I stepped into a community reeling from their own tragedies. They were grieving the murder of an officer. The island was in lockdown. People were isolated and frightened. An opioid crisis had just been declared, with 20 young lives lost in just a few months. Trauma was everywhere. In me, in the officers I was now leading, and in the community itself. I knew my role was to help, but I was left asking myself a question. How do you lead people to heal when you're broken yourself? It was evident on my arrival that trauma and shock had enveloped the island after the tragic shooting of that officer. I learned that 3 of our officers had arrived on scene that day, and under the potential threat of gunfire, had heroically made efforts to rescue their fatally wounded friend and colleague. My priority was to address that trauma and recognize that the officers, the team, and their families, as well as the First Nations communities, were all deeply impacted by that officer's murder. I relied on the 4 Ps. The first, purpose. Finding common ground. I remembered that every recruit that I'd ever met started their career with the same sentiment. I want to help. I want to make a difference. And at first, suiting up in uniform brings a sense of unity, a feeling of euphoria. The best job in the world, however, comes with a cost. We come into the job. The purpose that brings us in can sometimes be lost or forgotten. Purpose isn't about the job. It's about the meaning we create when we serve others. Purpose brings us together and reminds us that even in the darkest moments, we each have a role. The second P is power. Power can be used to protect and heal, or to harm and control. Police have the ability to take away freedoms. To victims, we may be heroes. To others, we are authority figures. often hate it. And yes, power can corrupt. The slope is quick. I've seen it. But real power doesn't come from control. It comes from connection. Gandhi said it best. Power based in love is 1,000 times more effective than power based in fear. And that's the power we need now. The third P is partnerships. They often begin in family. Yet in policing, we know that we have inordinately high rates of both PTSD and divorce. It's important to keep sight of these connections. They can often be lost. As an example, speaking of divorce, my husband called me one day at work, and he said, "Did you look into registering our son for the Take Your Kid to Work Day?" "No, but I looked into it," I said. "It's only for kids in grade 9. There was a long pause on the end of the phone. He said, "He is in grade 9. Mother of the Year, that close. Policing is heavy. Crisis and suffering take a toll. Negativity can seep in your bones. Purpose is about connection. Partnerships are also about connection. It's how we rebuild, whether in a police team, a community, or a family. At the funeral for the 20 young people who lost their lives, I decided to do something unexpected. Instead of shaking hands with the 50 family members who had appeared and came that day in that circle, I decided to hug every one of them in full uniform. Hug. And in those hugs, through grief and tears, a bridge was built. Not just between the police and the community, but in me as well. Partnerships are how we rebuild. Healing requires human connection. Partnerships are about vulnerability, learning to trust, even if you feel broken yourself. Which brings us to the fourth P, which is play. As a patrol supervisor, I made it a point to inject levity and humor wherever possible. At roll call, what we know as parade, I would often have the officers, grown-ups with guns, playing charades before we went out on the road. We would put on fake mustaches for group photos and stage dance-offs before going out on shift. Those moments of laughter weren't frivolous. They were survival. And yet, as we move through policing, we realize that play doesn't erase pain, but it creates space for hope, and hope keeps us moving forward. I was fortunate on the island to be introduced to the Anishinaabe ways, the 7 grandfather teachings, the way of gratitude, the prophecies such as the 7th fire, and the eagle and the condor, where it's said that when the eagle from the north meets the condor from the south, that all races and nations would return to indigenous ways, connecting to land and spirit. I learned that they don't say goodbye in Anishinaabemowin. They say, Bamapi, I'll see you again. And I couldn't stop thinking about all the people that I'd met over the decades of policing. People in shelters, on calls, on the streets. People who'd lost their voices, silenced by trauma. And while on that beautiful island, surrounded by water and tragedy and suffering, the idea of whisper was born. Based on the 4 Ps, it's not a program, but a living covenant. Whisper stands for we heal in safety, peace, empowerment, and resilience. Rooted in body-based healing, self-protection, cultural wisdom, and the belief that everyone deserves to find their voice again. It starts with breath, then boundaries, then belief. And belief is how I found the 5th P. It reminds us of the teachings of Senator Murray Sinclair, who says that there are 4 questions that every person in every nation must ask. 1, who am I? 2, why am I here? Good question. 3, where do I come from? And 4, where am I going? And it's that last one that never left me. Where are we going? Not just tomorrow, not next year, but life beyond. And I found my answer. At the Walk for the Opioid Crisis, I met a young girl, just 12 years old. She came up to me holding a poster, tearfully, of her father, Murray. That night, I had a dream. And in that dream, I met Murray. Only he wasn't speaking. He was sitting on a log by a fire, holding up a pinky finger with great determination. When I saw little Maria at the funeral weeks later, I hugged her and hesitated. I held up my finger the way Murray had in the dream, and I said, "Does this mean anything to you?" She gasped, and she looked at her grandma, and she said, "How does she know that?" She told me that that was their pinky promise, a secret, silent symbol between father and daughter. I said, "What does it mean?" She said, "I love you forever." And in that moment, I knew what my 4 Ps were missing. A 5th P, a promise that transcends time and space. And that promise is love. The 4 Ps, purpose, power, partnerships, and play, gave me the tools I needed during a very difficult time. But it was a tiny pinky promise that revealed a quiet truth. That every act of real policing, every act of real living must come from love. So I'm going to leave you with a question. What small act of love would you offer the world if you knew it had the potential to heal or inspire others? Would you be willing to join me? Raise your pinky. Now ask yourself, what promise will you offer the world? It doesn't have to be big. but it matters. Because the most powerful voice we have is love. Chimigwech, Bamapi.